Doctor, treat her immediately. She is my daughter. Please make sure she's okay. Yes, sir. I'll do my best.
Her small hand trembled against the hospital rail, blood soaking through a stranger's borrowed jacket, while doctors who'd sworn oaths to save lives instead debated whether her life was worth the paperwork. Then the doors opened, and the most feared man in Seoul said 4 words that changed everything. If you believe no child should ever be turned away because of what she doesn't have, no ID, no guardian, no guarantee, hit like and subscribe right now. This story is for the ones who still believe compassion shouldn't come with a price tag. Stay with us till the end. The rain in Seoul that night wasn't gentle. It came down in sheets, hammering the glass doors of Seoul General like it had a grudge against the city, and maybe it did. Inside, under lights so white they made everyone look a little bit dead already, a 9-year-old girl named Zuri Edu lay on a gurney that had seen better patients. She wasn't supposed to be anyone's problem tonight. That was the trouble. No ID, no guardian, no guarantee of payment. Dr. Han said it the way a waiter recites a menu he doesn't actually want you to order from. He said it to the room, not to Zuri, because eye contact might have reminded him she was a person and not a liability. Nurse Amina Boateng, the only adult in the building who seemed to remember what the word emergency was supposed to mean, planted herself beside the girl's bed like a tree that had decided, after years of being uprooted, this particular ground was worth dying on. "She's 9, Amina said. She threw herself in front of a motorcycle to save her little brother. That's not a billing question. That's a person bleeding out." Nobody moved. In hospitals, as in life, the difference between a tragedy and a miracle is usually just a matter of who's standing in the doorway when it happens. That's when the automatic doors sighed open, and the air pressure in the room changed like the building itself had taken notice. Kang Do-hyun didn't look like much at first glance. A dark coat, quiet shoes, the unhurried gait of a man who had never once needed to run for anything in his life because things simply arranged themselves around him. But 2 of the older nurses went pale the moment they saw his face, and one resident actually took a step backward, the universal body language for, "Oh no, I know exactly who that is." He walked straight to Zuri's bedside, looked at her the way you'd look at something you'd lost a long time ago and just found again in a drawer you'd forgotten existed. "She is my daughter," he said, calm, certain. The kind of sentence that didn't invite follow-up questions. "Treat her as you would treat mine." The lie, if it even was one, moved through the room faster than the sirens outside. Within 90 seconds, the emergency bay that had been a shrug became a full orchestra. Specialists appeared from nowhere. Equipment rolled in. Dr. Han, who 30 seconds earlier had been reciting insurance policy like scripture, was now sprinting down the hall shouting orders because his career had very suddenly developed a strong personal interest in Zuri's survival. Funny how mercy moves so much faster once it's wearing a name people are afraid of. Zuri, drifting in and out, stared up at the stranger claiming to be her father with the confused, half-delirious math of a child trying to solve an equation nobody had taught her. She had never seen this man before in her life. She was almost sure of that. Almost. He didn't leave her side. Not even when the surgical team, midway through scrubbing in, politely suggested that family wait outside for the procedure. He looked at them the way a locked door looks at someone rattling its handle, patient, immovable, and entirely unbothered by the noise. They stopped suggesting things. Outside, the rain kept falling, and somewhere across the city, phones were already lighting up. A man like Kang Do-hyun didn't walk into a public hospital and make declarations. Men like him sent lawyers, sent money, sent silence. The fact that he'd sent himself meant something, and in the world Do-hyun operated in, meaning was more dangerous than any weapon. By the time Zuri was wheeled toward surgery, unconscious and unaware that her name was about to become a headline, a single question was already spreading through the hospital's staff like the rain outside, quiet, relentless, and impossible to stop. Who was this girl, really? And why did the most dangerous man in Seoul look at a stranger's daughter like he'd been waiting his whole life to find her? If you believe every child deserves to be saved, not because of who claims them, but because of who they are, hit subscribe. The doctors who almost turned her away certainly didn't. By morning, the rain had stopped, but the storm had only just started. Reporters gathered outside Seoul General like moths who'd discovered a floodlight. Cameras up, questions loaded. None of them actually caring about the little girl fighting for her life 11 floors above them. All they cared about was the man who'd walked in and rewritten the rules of triage with 4 words. Feared crime boss reveals secret daughter. The headline was wrong. It was also, in the strange economy of the underworld, exactly as good as being right. Somewhere across the city, in an office with too much marble and not enough sunlight, Choi Baek-ho read the story on his phone and smiled the way a shark smiles at chum. He'd spent 3 years waiting for Kang Do-hyun to show a single crack in the porcelain of his reputation. A daughter, real or invented, was more than a crack. It was a door. A daughter, Choi said to the men around him, tasting the word like it was something expensive and slightly spoiled. Do-hyun finally has something soft enough to hold on to, something soft enough to take. He didn't care whether the girl was real. In his world, perception was the currency, and truth was just the interest you paid later, if you paid it at all. Back at the hospital, Amina hadn't slept. She told herself it was because Zuri's vitals needed watching, but the truth sat heavier than that. Something about the whole night refused to add up. The timing, the certainty in Do-hyun's voice, the way he hadn't asked a single question before claiming a child he'd apparently never met. Curiosity, in Amina's experience, was usually a polite word for unfinished business. She pulled Zuri's admission file. Then, on a hunch she couldn't quite explain, she pulled the hospital's archived records, the ones from years back, the ones nobody bothered to digitize because nobody thought anyone would come looking. What she found made her sit down. A patient, unnamed at intake, brought in during the bloody territory wars that had built half the empires in this city. A stab wound that should have been fatal. A nurse who stayed on shift for 12 straight hours past every reasonable limit, refusing hospital administration's demand to discharge a man who couldn't pay and couldn't be identified. The nurse's name was written in careful handwriting at the bottom of the chart. Adu. Amina's hand went still over the page. Zuri's mother. She hadn't just treated a patient that night years ago. She'd fought for him, the way Amina had fought for Zuri just hours earlier, like it was instinct, like it was the only thing that made the job worth doing. And the man she'd saved, the nameless patient who should have died on that table, had walked out of this hospital, and as far as anyone could tell, never once looked back. Until now. Amina sat with that thought long enough for the coffee in her hand to go cold. Do-hyun hadn't walked into this hospital by coincidence. He'd walked in because he'd finally found the family of the woman who'd once refused to let him die for lack of paperwork. The one act of mercy his empire had never managed to buy, replicate, or repay. He hadn't lied when he called Zuri his daughter. He'd simply arrived at the truth a little early. Down the hall, Do-hyun sat outside the recovery room, hands folded, coat still damp from the storm he hadn't bothered to shield himself from on the way in. A young orderly, brave or foolish, or both, finally worked up the nerve to ask the question everyone was thinking. "Sir, forgive me, but is she really your daughter?" Do-hyun didn't look up right away. When he did, his expression wasn't the cold, unreadable mask the tabloids loved to print. It was something quieter, something that looked almost like grief wearing a very good suit. "Not yet," he said, "but her mother saved my life once when no one else would touch me. I intend to make sure that debt doesn't die with her." The orderly didn't know what to say to that, so he said nothing, which was probably the wisest choice he'd make all week. Outside, Choi Baek-ho's men were already moving, quietly repositioning across the city like pieces on a board only they could see. A crime boss with a weakness was an opportunity. And opportunities in this city had a short shelf life. Nobody in that hospital yet understood that the real danger hadn't arrived at the doors yet. It was just getting dressed. Zuri woke up to the sound of a machine beeping steadily beside her, and for a moment, in that fog between sleep and survival, she forgot to be afraid. Then she remembered the motorcycle. The scream that had come out of her own throat, not her brother's. The white-hot pain in her side. And she remembered faintly a man's voice cutting through the noise like a blade through silk. "She is my daughter." Her eyes opened fully. The man was still there. He sat in a chair that looked too small and too plain for someone who apparently owned half the shadows in Seoul, his coat draped over the back, his hands folded like he'd been waiting for her to wake up since the beginning of time. "Who are you?" Zuri's voice came out cracked and small. "My name is Do-hyun," he said. No embellishment, no performance, just a name, offered plainly, the way you'd hand someone something fragile. "You said I was your daughter." She frowned, the kind of frown only children can produce, equal parts suspicion and exhaustion. "I don't know you." "No," he agreed, "you don't. But I knew your mother." Something in Zuri's chest tightened at that word. Mother. A word she didn't get to use much anymore, not since the illness that took her 3 years ago. Not since it had just been her and Kofi and whatever relatives could afford to keep them for a few months at a time before quietly running out of patience. She saved my life once, Do-hyun continued. A long time ago. I never got the chance to thank her properly. I intend to fix that now, however I can. Zuri didn't fully understand what he meant. She was 9, and grief has a way of making even simple explanations feel like riddles. But something about the steadiness in his voice, the total absence of pity, the refusal to talk down to her, made her trust him in a way she couldn't articulate. Down the hall, Amina watched through the window, arms crossed, feeling the particular ache of a woman who has just learned that mercy sometimes takes decades to circle back around. She didn't get long to sit with it. Her phone buzzed. A text from hospital security, terse and unambiguous. Unauthorized vehicles in the west lot. Possible security concern. Advise staff to remain calm. Amina had worked in this hospital long enough to know that remain calm was code for something is about to go very wrong. Across town, Choi Baek-ho was not remaining calm because men like Choi didn't need to. Calm was a luxury reserved for people who weren't currently orchestrating leverage against the most dangerous man in the city. He stood at his window, watching the skyline, turning a glass of something expensive in slow circles. He made his weakness public, Choi said to the man beside him. A little girl he barely knows, guarded like she's made of gold. That's not sentiment. That's a target with a name on it. And if she's not really his daughter? The man asked. Choi smiled, unbothered. Then it costs us nothing to test the theory. If he lets her go, he's weak and dishonest. If he protects her, he's weak and sentimental. Either way, we win. It was the kind of logic that made sense only to men who had never once loved anything they weren't willing to sacrifice for profit, which was, in fact, the entire architecture of Choi's worldview. A system built on the idea that compassion is always, eventually, a liability. That kindness is just weakness that hasn't been exploited yet. It's worth asking yourself, do you believe that? Do you believe kindness makes a person weaker? Or do you believe, like Amina did, like Do-hyun was slowly beginning to remember, that it's the one thing worth protecting no matter the cost? If you believe compassion is strength and not a weakness to be exploited, say so in the comments. Choi Baek-ho certainly won't. Men like him never do. Back in the recovery room, Do-hyun's phone lit up with a message from his head of security. 3 words that made his jaw tighten in a way Zuri had never seen on an adult before. They're already here. He stood, smoothing his coat, and for the first time since walking through those hospital doors, something like real fear flickered behind his composed expression. Not for himself, but for the girl watching him with wide, uncertain eyes, and the little brother somewhere down the hall who had no idea how quickly his whole world was about to tilt sideways again. Zuri, he said quietly, I need you to stay right here, no matter what you hear. She didn't understand why. Not yet, but the beeping of the monitor beside her suddenly sounded very loud in the silence that followed. Kofi Adu was 6 years old, and he had already learned more about waiting rooms than any child should have to know. He sat in the family lounge down the hall from his sister's recovery room, swinging his legs off the edge of a chair built for adults, clutching a juice box someone had handed him hours ago and never finished. He didn't know where his sister was exactly. He didn't know who the tall Korean man in the dark coat was either, except that the nurses treated him like weather, something you didn't argue with, only prepared for. What Kofi did know was that something had changed in the air. Adults kept walking faster, voices kept dropping lower, and the security guard who'd been standing by the elevator all morning had suddenly been joined by 3 more, all of them wearing the same tight, unsmiling expression his sister wore right before she'd shoved him out of the way of that motorcycle. He didn't know the word for it yet, but his body did. It was the feeling of a held breath. Down in the parking garage, the held breath broke. 4 vehicles rolled in without headlights, which is the kind of detail that means nothing to a security camera and everything to the men trained to notice it. Do-hyun's head of security, a broad, quiet man named Tai Sung, watched the feed from his phone and felt his stomach drop somewhere near his shoes. Lockdown, he said into his radio. Now, every entrance. But lockdowns take time, and Choi Baek-ho's men had never been patient people. They moved through the service corridor like a rumor, fast, quiet, deniable, and by the time hospital security realized what was happening, 2 of them were already past the first checkpoint. Their objective wasn't subtle. It never had been. If Do-hyun had a weakness wearing a hospital gown, Choi intended to hold it. Upstairs, Do-hyun's phone buzzed once more. Movement confirmed. West stairwell. They're heading for the pediatric wing. He was moving before the message finished loading, coat forgotten on the chair, every instinct in his body reorganizing itself around a single fact. Kofi was alone. He found Amina first, catching her arm hard enough that she nearly dropped her clipboard. Where is the boy? Family lounge, second floor, he should still be. She didn't get to finish. An alarm began wailing through the building, the low, insistent tone that hospitals reserve for the situations nobody trains hard enough for. The evacuation that followed was chaos dressed up as procedure. Patients wheeled out of rooms, staff shouting directions that contradicted each other. And somewhere in the crush of moving bodies, a 6-year-old boy who had already survived one impossible night was swept away from the nurse assigned to watch him, swallowed by a hallway suddenly full of strangers. Kofi didn't scream. He'd learned, somewhere in the last year of losing his mother and bouncing between relatives, that screaming rarely brought anyone back faster. Instead, he did the only thing that made sense to a frightened child in an unfamiliar building. He ran, following the flow of people, until the flow spat him out into a stairwell that was suddenly terribly empty. That was where the two men found him. They weren't gentle about it. One grabbed his arm hard enough to bruise, already speaking into a phone, already treating the boy less like a person and more like a bargaining chip with shoelaces. Kofi did the only thing left in his arsenal. He screamed his sister's name, and then, without quite knowing why, he screamed a different name entirely, the one everyone in the hospital had been whispering all day. Do Hyun! 2 floors up, the sound cut through the alarm like a blade. Do-hyun didn't hesitate, didn't calculate, didn't do any of the careful, controlled things that had built his reputation over 20 years in a business where hesitation got people killed. He simply ran, past Tae-sung, past the bodyguards moving to intercept him, past every voice shouting for him to wait, to let the professionals handle it, to think of his own safety first. There are men who build empires by protecting themselves above everything else. And then there are men who, given one impossible choice, discover, usually far too late, usually at the worst possible moment, that they were never really that kind of man to begin with. Do-hyun hit the stairwell door at a dead run, and the sound of Kofi's second scream told him he wasn't going to make it in time. The stairwell smelled like bleach and fear, 2 things that don't usually belong in the same sentence, but had somehow found each other that afternoon. Do-hyun came through the door already moving, and what he saw arranged itself into a single, clarifying image. Kofi, small and furious and terrified in equal measure, one arm twisted in the grip of a man twice his size. The second man already turning toward the noise of the door with the flat, unbothered expression of someone who had done this exact job many times before. There wasn't time for negotiation. There rarely is in the moments that actually matter. Do-hyun crossed the landing in 3 strides and drove his shoulder into the closer man before either of them registered he'd arrived, the impact sending them both into the railing hard enough to rattle the whole stairwell. It wasn't elegant. It wasn't the kind of controlled cinematic violence people imagined when they whispered his name in restaurants. It was 2 grown men grappling on a hospital staircase over a 6-year-old boy, ugly and desperate and entirely real. Kofi, run! Do-hyun shouted, and for once in his life gave an order with absolutely no expectation of obedience because the boy was 6 and terrified and had every reason in the world to freeze instead. But Kofi didn't freeze. He'd learned something from his sister, whether he realized it or not, that sometimes the bravest thing a person can do is move anyway, scared or not. He wrenched free of the loosened grip and bolted for the door above, small feet slapping against concrete, and didn't look back even when he heard glass shatter somewhere behind him. That was the second man. He'd drawn something from his jacket, and whatever calculations had governed his employer's plan clearly hadn't accounted for the possibility of actually hurting a child in a building full of witnesses, cameras, and, as it turned out, one extremely motivated crime boss with nothing left to lose. Do-hyun saw the weapon a half-second before he understood what it meant and made the only decision available to a man out of time. He put himself between the boys retreating back and the stairwell, and the window above them exploded in a spray of glass and rain-soaked wind as the shot went wide, chewing into the wall instead of anything that breathed. For one suspended moment, nobody moved. Then Tae-sung's men hit the stairwell from below, and the balance of the fight tipped hard and fast in a direction Choi Baek-ho's men clearly hadn't planned for. It was over in less than a minute. The 2 intruders were on the ground, disarmed, security radios crackling with confirmation up and down the building. Do-hyun stood in the wreckage of shattered glass and scattered evacuation notices, breathing hard, one sleeve torn, and felt, for the first time in longer than he could remember, genuinely, physically afraid. Not for himself. That fear had died somewhere years ago, buried under 2 decades of building an empire nobody could touch. This fear was new. It tasted like Kofi's scream. It tasted like almost. He found the boy 2 floors up, curled against the wall where security had caught him, shaking too hard to speak. Do-hyun knelt in front of him, glass still in his hair, and did the only thing that felt right in that moment. He didn't ask if Kofi was hurt, didn't launch into questions about what happened. He simply opened his arms and let the boy decide. Kofi decided fast. He crashed into Do-hyun's chest and held on with the specific, bone-deep grip of a child who has already learned that safety is not guaranteed and must therefore be seized the second it appears. Do-hyun held him back just as hard, coat torn, hands trembling slightly in a way his enemies would never have believed possible. For the men who worked for him, the ones who had spent years watching Kang Do-hyun make decisions with the cold, unblinking calculus of a man who had long since stopped counting bodies, this was the moment something shifted permanently. They had seen him build. They had seen him destroy. They had never once seen him run toward danger with absolutely nothing to gain from it. Tae-sung, arriving breathless at the top of the stairs, looked at the scene, his boss on his knees, a terrified child in his arms, glass glittering on the floor like something out of a dream nobody had asked to have, and understood, with sudden and total clarity, that the empire he'd spent his career protecting had just quietly gained a new, undefended flank. It wasn't weakness. Do-hyun would have argued that point until his last breath, but it was, unmistakably, something the old Kang Do-hyun would never have allowed himself to have. Zuri heard the gunshot from 2 floors below, and something in her small, healing body understood it before her mind did. The way muscle remembers a wound long after the mind has tried to forget it. "Kofi," she whispered, and tried to sit up. Tubes and monitors be damned. Amina was at her side in an instant, hands gentle but firm, pressing her back against the pillows. "Stay still. I'll find out what's happening, I promise you." "That's my brother." Zuri's voice cracked, not from pain this time, but from something closer to fury. "You don't understand. He's all I have left. If something happens to him, nothing is going to happen to him." Amina said it with more certainty than she felt, which is, in the end, most of what courage actually is. By the time Do-hyun carried Kofi back into the recovery wing, the boy's face buried in his shoulder, glass still glittering faintly in the crime boss's torn sleeve, the entire floor had gone eerily quiet, the particular silence of a building that has just remembered how fragile its safety really is. Zuri saw them first. Whatever fear had been building in her chest broke apart the moment Kofi lifted his head and found her eyes across the room. "Zuri!" He wriggled free of Do-hyun's arms the second he was close enough, scrambling onto the edge of her bed despite Amina's protests, and the two siblings collided in the kind of hug that doesn't care about tubes or stitches or hospital rules or anything at all except the simple, overwhelming fact of being alive at the same time in the same room. Do-hyun stood back and watched, and something in his chest, something he had spent 20 years keeping carefully sealed away, cracked open just slightly further. He thought of his wife, Soo-min, gone 6 years now, who had spent the last months of her life talking about the children she wanted to adopt, the family she wanted to build out of the broken pieces the world kept discarding. He'd promised her he'd find a way, once the wars were over, once the empire was secure, once there was finally time. There had never been time. There is never time for men who measure their lives in territory and leverage instead of moments like this one. Watching Kofi cling to his sister like she was the last solid thing in an unstable world, Do-hyun understood, with the clarity that only near catastrophe seems to provide, that he had been given, completely undeserved, entirely unearned, a second chance at the promise he'd buried with his wife. "Sir." Tae-sung appeared in the doorway, expression grim. "Both intruders in custody. We traced the vehicles. It's Choi Baek-ho." Of course it was. Do-hyun felt the old, familiar cold settle back over him, the version of himself that had built an empire out of decisive, merciless calculation. Choi had made a mistake tonight, and in Do-hyun's world, mistakes of this magnitude only ever ended one way. But looking at the two children on the bed, still wrapped around each other, still shaking slightly from adrenaline neither of them fully understood yet, he made a decision that surprised even himself. "No retaliation tonight," he said quietly. "Not here. Not with them watching." Tae-sung blinked. "Sir, with respect, Choi just tried to—" "I know exactly what he tried to do." Do-hyun's voice stayed level, but something underneath it had gone sharp as glass. "And he will answer for it. But not in a building full of children and cameras and people who came here to heal, not to bury their mistakes in blood." He looked back toward the bed, toward Zuri's fierce, protective grip on her brother's hand. There's a difference between justice and vengeance, Taesung. I intend to remember that from now on. It was perhaps the most honest thing Do-hyun had said in years. Later, once the hospital had quieted, once security had swept every corridor twice, once the reporters outside had finally been given a statement vague enough to satisfy nobody and specific enough to stop the worst of the speculation, Do-hyun sat once more in the small chair beside Zuri's bed. She was awake, watching him with the same searching, unguarded curiosity she'd had since the moment she opened her eyes. "You got hurt," she said, nodding at his torn sleeve. "Because of Kofi." "Yes." "Why?" It was the same question, essentially, that the orderly had asked days before. But coming from her, exhausted and small and entirely without pretense, it landed differently. "Because your mother taught me something once," Do-hyun said slowly, without ever knowing she was doing it. "She showed me that some people help others without asking what's in it for them. I spent a long time forgetting that lesson. Tonight reminded me." Zuri considered this with the grave seriousness only children manage convincingly. "So you're not really our dad?" "No," he admitted. "Not by blood. Not yet, if you'll allow me to try and earn it properly." Outside, the rain had finally stopped completely, and somewhere in the quiet, the beginning of something neither Zuri nor Kofi had words for, yet had already taken root. 3 weeks passed before Zuri was finally cleared to leave the hospital, and in that time the city had learned to stop asking questions it wasn't going to get honest answers to. The tabloids had run their theories into the ground: secret daughter, hidden family, softening kingpin, until the story grew stale from repetition, and the reporters wandered off toward whatever scandal came next. That suited Do-hyun fine. He had never needed the world to understand him. He only needed it for once, to leave 2 children alone long enough for them to heal. Choi Baek-ho did not fare so well. Word moves through the underworld the way it moves through hospitals, fast, and always toward whoever's weakest. Choi had gambled that a man distracted by sentiment would be a man distracted by everything else too. He'd read Do-hyun's compassion as an opening. What he hadn't accounted for was that mercy and precision were not, in fact, opposites. Within 2 weeks, the men who supplied Choi's operation, financed his ambitions, and protected his flanks had quietly, methodically been persuaded, through means Do-hyun never discussed in front of the children and never needed to, that their continued association with Choi Baek-ho was no longer a sound business decision. No violence, no headlines, just the slow, suffocating silence of a man discovering that every door he tried had somehow already been closed before he reached it. By the time Choi understood what had happened to his empire, there wasn't enough of it left to fight for. He disappeared from the city not long after, not buried, not martyred, just erased. The particular fate reserved for men who mistake another man's grief for weakness and never live to correct the arithmetic. Do-hyun took no pleasure in it. He'd promised himself, on that hospital floor, that he would remember the difference between justice and vengeance. He kept that promise. But he made certain, all the same, that no one would ever again look at Zuri and Kofi and see an opportunity instead of 2 children who deserved to simply exist without being used as leverage. The paperwork for guardianship took longer than the war with Choi had. Bureaucracy, it turned out, feared no one, not even a man whose name once emptied restaurants. Do-hyun sat through every meeting, every home inspection, every skeptical social worker's question with the same patience he'd shown in that stairwell, because some things he'd learned were worth earning slowly and properly. No shortcuts, no intimidation, no matter how easy either would have been. On the day it finally became official, Amina was there. She'd become something between a nurse and a fixture in their lives by then, the kind of person who shows up not because she's asked to, but because leaving never occurs to her. "You did good," she told Do-hyun, watching Kofi chase Zuri around the small garden behind the guardianship office, both of them laughing in a way that would have seemed impossible 3 weeks earlier. "Your wife would be proud." Do-hyun didn't answer right away. He watched the children, his children now, in every way that mattered, and thought of Sumin, of the promise he'd carried like an unpaid debt for 6 long years. "I think," he said finally, "she'd say I was slow, but she'd forgive the delay." That evening, in the quiet of the house that would soon become genuinely, legally, unmistakably theirs, Zuri found him standing on the balcony, looking out over a city that had, for the first time in a long time, gone still. "Dad?" she said, testing the word carefully, like a stone she wasn't sure would hold her weight. Do-hyun turned, and something in his chest, the same something that had cracked open in a hospital hallway weeks before, finally, fully gave way. "Yes?" Kofi wants to know if we can get a dog. He laughed, actually laughed, a sound that surprised even him with how unfamiliar and welcome it felt. We'll discuss it. She smiled, satisfied, and turned to head back inside, then paused at the door. Thank you, she said quietly, for not leaving, even when it got scary. I made a promise, Do-hyun said simply, to your mother, though she never knew it, and now to you. Somewhere below, the city carried on the way cities do, indifferent to the quiet miracles happening in its apartments, unaware that the most feared man in Seoul had spent a hospital night discovering the one thing his empire had never managed to give him. Not power, not fear, not even revenge. Family, chosen freely, in the space between a debt and a promise, and kept for good this time.